Motor Trends, bringing you a look at the South African auto industry through the eyes of its leaders. In this edition, the Standard Bank People's Wheels Awards.
Hello and welcome to Motor Trends. Now in this edition we're taking a look at the Standard Bank People's Wheels Awards. The awards were held late last year at an event hosted by comedian Joey Rasdin. Now he was brilliant, but he didn't detract from the real stars of the show, and that was the cars that came out tops in their various categories. We're going to be looking at those in more detail over the next half hour and finding out more about some of the trends in vehicle buying and financing in South Africa. With me in studio I have Wynter Murdoch, who heads up the whole project. I have Neil Higgs from TNS Research Surveys, and of course bringing in the facts and figures I have the title sponsors of the event and the Auto Annual Standard Bank. Soundy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Wynter, you had 100,000 votes for the actual awards themselves.
That's correct, over 101,400. We were very pleased with the response, and I think a lot of it was driven by social media. But we had a concerted campaign, and I think there was a very good take-up on that, so we were very happy, and I think it's a good reflection of what the consumer thinks about cars in the market.
Well, particularly with the Polo Viva being the overall winner.
Yes, it garnered around about 1.4% of all the votes. It was closely followed by the Kia Picanto,
which won in your first one, didn't it?
That's correct. So I think people know the kind of cars they'd like to drive, that they can afford, and the ones that want to drive, but they're still working towards them.
Yeah. Sydney, your sponsors again this year, you obviously see the value in being associated with it. What do you do with the kind of research that comes out of these awards?
Look, it's very useful not only for ourselves but also for the industry. What interests us more in terms of this sponsorship is actually the involvement of the consumers themselves, the participation of those consumers. As you know, we are a bank that moves forward, and so we're involved in anything that moves in as far as finance is concerned. So there's a good connection, but I think the big thing is that consumers have a voice, and we're very thrilled that our customer base and even people beyond our customer base can have a voice as to which is the car that they prefer in the South African context.
The voice, Neil, on the People's Wheels Awards showed that the Germans really rank very highly. Apart from Mercedes being voted top in the ownership survey, they scooped a whole bunch of categories in the awards.
Yes, there were, I figured how many categories now?
They took 6 categories.
Six categories out of 30, which is the most.
In fact, German manufacturers accounted for 2/3 in total of those 30 categories. Yes.
What does it say? The top winner was a locally made car. Local is lacquer, but people still obviously look up to those German brands.
Absolutely. Well, Volkswagen is a German brand.
Yeah, that's true, but it's made locally.
Yeah, no, I think that they do. I think there's a perceived quality and value that perhaps some of the other contemporary brands don't actually reinforce through things like marketing and stuff like that.
Talk us through some of the other big winners, Wynter, in terms of the categories, like small cars, medium cars, some of the big highlights.
Well, I think probably the biggest overall winner was the Polo Viva, and thank you very much for a very nice picture of it. But the Polo itself came in. Audi was pretty significant in a number of categories. Merc as well, significant in 6 of the categories. Volkswagen's associated brands like Porsche and Lamborghini also took top honors in some of the categories. The idea is really across those 30 categories you have a spread of the market, and people vote for the cars within those categories that are priced similarly and represent the same type of vehicle.
Sydney, do you find that the results are reflective of the types of cars people are buying and financing?
Indeed. If you look at how much the smaller fuel-efficient vehicles have grown in the South African market in terms of both the volumes being sold, but also what we see from a financing point of view, it's a good indication. If you look at the car that won, But also to Wynter's point, you also see quite a lot of aspirational purchases around the SUVs and the much more luxurious brands. So I mean, they make close to, or just under 20% of the South African passenger market is actually SUV and luxury vehicles, which is a good indication that those that are wealthy will continue to purchase at that level.
Yeah.
But also from a people point of view, the more smaller fuel efficient vehicles are the ones that will be popular.
Well, it's always interesting what people buy, but of course the ownership survey is the one that really tells us what they like to stick with and what they love actually owning. We're going to get to that in the third part of the show. Right now, it's time to take a break.
After the break, more motor trends from the Standard Bank People's Wheels Awards. Welcome back to Motor Trends, the Standard Bank People's Wheels Awards.
Welcome back to Motor Trends. Now, in this special, we're looking at the Standard Bank People's Wheels Awards. This year, the Polo Vivo won out as the overall people's choice for the vehicle they would most like to own. It speaks volumes about what South African consumers want. To find out more about what the buyer out there wants, we're going to turn our attention now to Sydney. Sydney, what are the major trends in vehicle buying and financing at the moment?
I think the big issue from a financing point of view is the installment, the size of the installment and the affordability of that installment. So we see that consumers who want finance are looking for something that is going to be affordable. So they'll look at various ways of ensuring that the affordability is met, either by looking at extending the term period and building in residual values at the end of the contract, and indeed in relation to the price of the vehicle that will now need to come into the picture. And this is why the earlier point that I made around affordable, small, fully spec'd vehicles is actually what we see. But obviously, from an aspirational point of view, people still want to drive much more better vehicles than sometimes they can afford. And this is where the financial institutions come in and look at the risk appropriately in order to advise them accordingly.
Do banks like or dislike residual?
Well, I think you can't necessarily say no or yes because it depends on the individual. So an individual personal assessment of the circumstances determines the right approach towards either taking a residual or not.
Wynter, as a motoring journalist, when is a residual a good idea and when is it not a good idea?
Well, I generally tend to think that if you can pay off the vehicle within your salary bracket as quickly as possible, that's the best alternative. And I know that that's difficult for a lot of people. So if they have the option of extending perhaps over a longer period to gain the independence that transport, your own personal transport brings, I don't think it's such a bad thing.
Okay. Neil, in terms of trends coming out of the research that's been conducted in terms of financing and buying cars, what were the highlights for you?
Well, there's some interesting trends going on from what Sydney just said. We found that the use or the need for credit grows as one ages. So the 18 to 24s, funnily enough, were the ones who are least likely to use credit because they tended to buy smaller vehicles, have the assistance of parents, or sometimes even pay cash.
That's fascinating.
But as you age, and obviously as you go up the corporate ladder and you buy a home and you get married and have children, the need for finance grows. So your 34s to 45s had the greatest need for finance. They're clearly the most upwardly mobile in the middle of their careers. And then again it diminishes off as you go to 65. And then to go to also to Sydney's earlier point, what we found was also by age that the young people have a very strong preference for the VW brand. And then as they age, the first one to benefit from the aging process, so to speak, is BMW. That leaps up at about 25, 30. And then that stays fairly constant for all across age groups. Ford and and Toyota stay fairly constant over all age groups, and then at around 45, Mercedes-Benz leaps up. So there's some very different trends by age as people switch in and out of vehicles as they progress through their career and their life circumstances change.
It'll be interesting to track that as well, because Mercedes-Benz have introduced to the market a lot of younger, sportier models now. So it will be interesting to see how that trend is affected.
Yeah, this is the first year we've had a big enough sample to do that age analysis, and I think it certainly made some of the people in the industry sit up and take notice.
In terms of Neil, in terms of the research and the poll demographics, was it quite a youthful demographic that completed the survey? I mean, it is, as you said, there was a lot of social media and it was online. Would it be fair to say that it was quite a youthful response?
We had 7% under 25. We had a quarter in the 34 to 45 age group, and then 5% in the 65 plus. So it followed a kind of an umbrella-shaped distribution, if you like. So it wasn't as young as I was expecting, given that we did this on the web. Very often with web-based surveys, you do tend to get a young skew, but it wasn't anything like as young as we expected. And I think it's partly a function of the car you can afford. You know, sometimes you can only afford a car you're really excited about as you get a bit older. So that tended to even everything out. So we had a good spread of demographics.
What we find on our buying program, Buyer's Guide, is that people seem to overstretch themselves always. I mean, you were saying about affordability, but people don't seem to factor in the petrol costs, the running costs, the insurance and things like that. Sydney, in terms of people overstretching themselves and bad debt, where are we at in terms of that?
I think if you look at recent interest rate hikes, the fact that the South African consumer is generally speaking, as you say, highly indebted. I mean, we're talking about 76% of disposable income going to debt. And just half of consumers, just under half of the consumers having bad credit records. It does point to that aspect, and this is why financial institutions have to be careful around how they advise for affordability, in order to take account the buffers that would cover for things that you're mentioning. The fuel price hikes have also been terrible. I mean, from the beginning of this year, we've seen a few hikes already. Last year in itself saw, I think it's about 28% fuel hikes, and then you factor in the issues of running cost of the vehicle, fuel, and then the toll fees and any other unforeseen circumstances that an individual would need to cater for. So this is why it's very important from a consumer point of view, to Wynter's earlier point, that you don't stretch yourself to the maximum of what you can afford. Because sometimes the way they present the information, we do still validate and verify, but sometimes it's more than the truth, as we would say.
Exactly. Well, I'm going to put you on the spot now. I mean, we've had an interest rate hike already this year. In terms of car sales for the year, predictions?
General predictions are that we're going to have a fairly flat year compared to last year. So not many of us are expecting growth. But that is also a factor not only of the interest rate, but also of the replacement cycle that we feel is probably at a peak now. And
where is that replacement cycle at the moment?
Well, you talk
it goes up and down, doesn't it?
About five years. Yeah. So when you look at that and the exchange rate and what it's going to do to vehicle price inflation, you start thinking that this year is actually going to be tougher.
It was interesting in the ownership survey, the three attributes that got the poorest response were cost of the car, the economy of the vehicle, and the standard features, i.e. people have to then buy into all the extras that they really want but can't always afford. So those are the three most negative attributes.
Interesting. We're going to get more of those results after the break. Stay with us.
After the break, more motor trends from the Standard Bank People's Wheels Awards. Welcome back to Motor Trends, the Standard Bank People's Wheels Awards.
Welcome back. Now, one of the first things you'll want to do when you're looking to buy a new or used car is ask someone who owns one what their experience has been like. The vehicle ownership survey that forms part of People's Wheels does all that legwork for you. Neil, Wynter and Sydney are back with us. Neil, if you can start by just giving us some insight into the numbers of people that completed the survey and some of the demographics.
Yes, well, overall we had around about 1,500 people. 1,522 was the final tally. We were very pleased with that result because it was more than 3 times higher than any previous survey. So we had, for the first time, a really good solid base to do more detailed analysis. It was split 70-30, male-female, and it was about half these responses came from Gauteng, and then about a fifth from the Western Cape and KZN, and then the rest of the country made up the rest. Good spread of ages, as I said earlier, going from 18 all the way up to over 65, but the bulk were in the middle groups, 24 to 55.
Okay. Now, before the break, you were telling us some of the interesting results
Yes.
that came out of that. The 3 things that people sort of look for most in a car they're buying. Was that correct? Was economy, standard features, or the things that dissuaded them?
Those are the things that correlate least with satisfaction. So they are the negative attributes, if you like.
Okay, it was economy, price, and
Standard features.
standard features. All right, so what were the things that were the positives?
Well, reliability always comes up number 1, and that's almost now a given in the South African motoring market. It's reliability is assumed. Then after that, you've got things like driving performance, looks and styling, and interior comfort, and performance come through quite strongly.
Okay.
We did find quite big differences by age, and one of the big findings of our survey this year was how different the 18 to 24-year-olds are compared with virtually everybody else.
Okay.
They're the least happy with their vehicle, and I suspect that they have to make quite a lot of compromises to get something that they can afford. And that is why as soon as they can afford something else, they tend to switch out.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, they're quite unhappy about safety features and build quality. And they're also quite negative about performance and driving comfort, driving style. Those are the things they really want improved. And those makes that crack that show the highest correlation with satisfaction. One of the things that we did find was that there are 3 attributes that overall across everybody are in urgent need of improvement. These are things that are regarded as important issues which are really not handled well.
Okay.
Noise and vibration, funnily enough, is one. It's been getting worse over the last 3 years. Then we've got also after-sales service, which of course is the service experience. That gets a very negative rating, and it's not getting any better at all. So in the last 3 years, that has not changed. It's negative rating at all.
Interesting. Sydney, just going back to the 18 to 24 age group and that the results coming out of that, it's quite interesting. Do you think because it's their first car, they expect more of the driving experience and the owning experience?
I guess, as Neil indicates, it's probably because their desire was somewhere else, but because of affordability, they got something that actually is not their first choice. But we also see the same trends in the financing world, where gradually we're seeing a growth in the younger market, but certainly not as big as the rest of the market. To the same extent that Neil indicated. The bigger base is in the 30, 40 to 45 range. That's where you see quite a lot of people financing, and it's got to do with a life cycle in their history. As they get married and they have better jobs, solid jobs, and they get into acquiring of assets. That's when it starts happening in terms of the financing of assets.
Well, I think the very fact that Mercedes-Benz is the aspirational car that the young people move first into does suggest that first car is somewhat of a compromise. And the very fact that standard features is a negative suggests that they really resent having to pay for the extras that they really want.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because, I mean, we ask the question of manufacturers quite often about the cost of vehicles, because it's something we get from our viewers all the time. Why are cars so expensive? Why are cars so expensive? And the offset is that in South Africa, manufacturers tend to spec their cars better. Wynter, did you find that sort of highly spec'd vehicles, the Volvos of the world, the French manufacturers, who tend to be an all-in rather than like the Germans who have add-on, fared well in the ownership survey?
Yeah, well, in the ownership survey, Volvo came in second place. So, and that was the first time that they'd actually featured. Which I think was quite a significant and important step for the brand.
It's a niche brand, and it's the first time we've had a big enough base to include them, and I thought it was really very interesting that they came in second, pushing BMW out, and BMW has been pretty historically always second. or sometimes tied with Mercedes-Benz. So it does go to show that some of these niche brands can do very well amongst their owners. They really love them.
Actually, very interesting, because also another thing that we often get on Buyer's Guide is, why do Volvos not retain their value? Which was another thing that you included in the survey this year, was the depreciation of vehicles. Wynter, can you give us some insight?
We published a list of around about 1,200 vehicles that were bought 2 years ago, and then we published their trade prices as they were at the end of last year. And it was, it's very interesting. Just to give you an example, Land Rover's Evoque, which the previous year won the People's Wheels Awards with the most votes. Interestingly, it retained something like 85% of its value and topped those value rankings, which brings me to the point that a lot of people, ordinary motorists, actually do have a good handle on what the value is going to be like when they buy the car. And I think that might be an influencing factor from whichever age group you come. I think the resale value or the trade-in value of that car becomes an important aspect of the purchase.
Certainly, do you agree with that? I mean, from your side, from a bank's point of view, do people care about resale value and how much they're going to get for the car when they trade it in?
Indeed.
And should they?
Well, they should. So the issue that you raised previously around residual values, that has a big connection to how a vehicle actually retains its value, because if at the end the amount you need to pay when you do trade in that vehicle cannot cover for that amount, you sit with a problem. And to that extent, I think Wynter is very right to say that consumers are well aware of that. They may not have the specifics for each of the brands, similar to all the analytics that guys like TransUnion would have, but they have the concept and they understand that they need to go for vehicles that are firstly reliable, because that reliability brings the issue of retention of value.
Yeah, resale.
Which in many ways could explain Toyota's kind of dominance of many segments of the market, because those factors are important.
How did Toyota do in the survey?
Toyota does pretty well in the middle to upper level of the survey. It's pretty consistent throughout. It's got a very good image in the South African market. But I think just going to all the points we've just been making, what's interesting about car buying and came through in our survey is it's a blend of the rational and the emotional. and you've got to sit in the vehicle and it's got to feel right.
Yeah.
And then you'll start to consider all the rational factors.
Yeah.
But it's a very fine blend between the emotional and the rational.
And that's across the age groups?
Across everybody, yes. I don't think it makes any difference how old you are. When you get into a new vehicle, you've got to feel like it's yours.
There was a lovely story about the grandmother who got into a sports car, and she said, "Gee, this sounds wonderful." And then someone who was around about 35 got in and said, "I could never live with a car that made this kind of noise."
And that's why we love cars. Thank you very much to all my guests for coming in and joining us and telling us more about the awards. Unfortunately, there's just far too much to get through, but that's it from Motor Trends for now. Remember, you can find the Auto Annual at all good bookstores, or for a summary of all the winners and losers of the awards, buy yourself a copy of the Sunday Times next weekend for a full supplement on the People's Wheels Awards. From the Motor Trends team, it's bye for now.
You've been watching Motor Trends, bringing you a look at the South African auto industry through the eyes of its leaders. This edition, featuring the People's Wheels Awards, was brought to you by Standard Bank.